Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're cutting straight through the massive headlines surrounding Europe's €200 billion AI offensive. We're going to look at the EU's new Invest AI program and figure out what's actually under the hood. Myth versus reality. Let's get right into it. Okay, let's dive into this absolutely staggering figure, €200 billion. This is the number the European Commission is practically shouting from the rooftops right now. I mean, at first glance, it sounds like a total game changer, right? It sounds like exactly the kind of financial firepower you'd need to build out state-of-the-art infrastructure, grab top-tier talent, and actually go toe-to-toe with the US and China. But when you sit down and actually read the fine print, the Commission isn't actually promising to spend $200 billion. The reality of this massive headline hinges entirely on one very specific word. And that brings us to the plot twist. It literally all comes down to the word mobilize. Now, in Brussels speak, to mobilize basically means putting in a little bit of public money and then crossing your fingers that private investors will swoop in and add a multiple of it. So suddenly this completely changes the math. We go from a guaranteed spending package to a hopeful 1 to 10 leverage ratio. Basically, for every public euro they put on the table, the EU is hoping 10 private euros will just magically follow. And as we're going to see, that is a massive, massive assumption in today's economic climate. So when you apply that 1 to 10 leverage target, this massive €200 billion pie instantly shrinks. We're left with just $50 billion in real, tangible public money. The rest of it, that huge $150 billion chunk, is purely hoped-for private capital. That money isn't sitting in a vault somewhere just waiting to be spent. It hasn't even been committed. And here's the kicker. This whole strategy relies on private growth capital, which is exactly what Europe is severely lacking right now. European pension funds typically shy away from venture risk, and there just isn't a deep, unified capital market like the one in the US. The Commission is basically hoping the market will suddenly deliver what the European market structurally just doesn't. Now, let's peel the onion a bit further. Out of that $50 billion, only $20 billion is actually reserved for the absolute core of this entire AI offensive, compute. This specific pot of money is earmarked to build 4 or 5 purpose-built AI gigafactories. These are those massive training facilities meant to give European researchers and startups the raw computing power they are absolutely desperate for, the kind of power that's heavily concentrated in the US right now. If you're a startup trying to build the next big language model, this is exactly the infrastructure you're waiting for. But as we dig into how these gigafactories are actually funded, that commitment shrinks even more. Yeah, the reality shrinks yet again when you realize the EU is only covering up to 17% of a facility's investment cost. 17%! The rest of the bill, that has to be footed by individual member states and private backers. So when you calculate what Brussels is firmly actually committing from its own budget to fund the beating heart of this entire offensive, the number just falls off a cliff. We aren't talking hundreds of billions anymore. We're not even talking tens of billions. The firmly committed contribution from Brussels drops to a mere single-digit billion sum. So let's track the math on this really sobering sequence. We start out with this awe-inspiring €200 billion headline, right? Then that filters down to $50 billion in actual public money. Then it narrows again to $20 billion specifically for compute. And finally, after you factor in that 17% funding cap, we are left with a single-digit billion sum that Brussels is actually on the hook for. What started out as this monumental, world-beating headline shrinks all the way down to a comparatively small, partly hypothetical check to fund the actual hardware of the AI revolution. But all of this brings us to an even more critical question. When does this single-digit billion sum actually start flowing? Because, look, in the world of artificial intelligence, pacing is literally everything. Technological leaps aren't happening in years, they're happening in quarters, sometimes even months. So even if we accept this much smaller investment number, we really need to know when European researchers and startups can actually plug into these new gigafactories and start training their models. Well, the numbers reveal a remarkably slow timeline for an industry that's moving at light speed. Get this. The plan was only agreed to in principle in early June of 2026. The formal call for the gigafactories doesn't even open until July 2026. And the actual silicon, the computers themselves, they aren't expected to even come online until 2027 or 2028. Currently, there's only a single site in Norway under construction. This rollout is so incredibly slow that the effort has been labeled late, slow, and quite literally not yet built. While competitors are aggressively deploying capital today, Europe is basically just presenting a funding structure and asking for tenders. And while Europe is waiting around until 2028, Just look at the jaw-dropping scale gap with the US hyperscalers. Over in Europe, we've got this 20 billion euro Gigafactory pot that's supposed to be stretched out over multiple years. Meanwhile, in the US, the four big hyperscalers, Amazon, Microsoft, Alphabet, and Meta, are projected to spend around $700 billion in capital expenditure in 2026 alone. Let that sink in. Just one single year. The contrast in sheer financial firepower is honestly staggering. It really puts the whole European offensive into a very sobering global perspective. To put this into even sharper focus, let's break down that US pacing. A single large US tech company is investing roughly 10 times as much in 1 year as Europe's entire multi-year gigafactory pot. We're talking Amazon planning roughly $200 billion, Microsoft around $190 billion. That rumored Stargate project alone has a budget of $500 billion. But here is maybe the most striking data point of all. While Europe is busy negotiating its multi-year budget, Microsoft is currently building a single data center on European soil down in Portugal for $10 billion. That one single facility from one private US company represents half of Europe's entire flagship compute budget. So this leads to a crucial point, and it's really the main takeaway from this whole analysis. We have to ask, does this shrinking, delayed funding actually address the structural roots of Europe's AI weakness? Because look, it's one thing to have a smaller budget than your competitors. It's a completely different problem if that budget doesn't even fix the underlying issues holding you back. Is this check, as small and late as it is, going to fundamentally change the landscape for tech in Europe? The short answer? No. Invest AI solves exactly none of these systemic issues. Just look at the structural realities on the ground. Europe's AI lag isn't just about missing a pot of money. It stems from industrial electricity prices that are roughly double the US level. It stems from grid connections and building permits that can literally take years to secure. It's about fragmented capital markets that lack late-stage funding, which leads to this massive drain of top-tier talent taking off for the US because that's where the compute and the big salaries are. Oh, and it stems from a 264 billion euro annual dependence on US clouds. Fundamentally, this Invest AI program leaves every single one of these structural roadblocks completely untouched. Now, to be totally fair and impartial here, we do have to look at the other side of the coin. There is a very legitimate counter-argument to be made. Using public seed money to leverage private capital, that's a completely standard economic model. No government funds massive infrastructure entirely on its own. And hey, even the US uses mobilized figures when they announce policies. The gigafactories Europe is planning are real, the call for tenders is coming soon, and doing something definitely beats doing absolutely nothing. It's a start, right? It provides a framework that simply didn't exist before. But ultimately, this leaves us with a highly provocative thought to wrap things up. Because those fundamental roadblocks we talked about, the high energy costs, the fragmented capital, the slow permits, the talent drain, because those remain totally unchanged, this initiative really is just a check. Money is a tool of a strategy, sure, but it isn't a strategy all by itself. As the analysis perfectly puts it, the EU mistakes a funding pot for a strategy. So it leaves us with one critical question to ponder. Can Europe truly compete in the most important technological race of our lifetime without fixing the structural foundation of its own economy? Well, that is definitely something we're going to have to keep a close eye on. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and as always, keep questioning the headlines.